The orbital station of the Veltari hegemony hung in the black, like a cathedral made of bone and light, its spires curving inward, as if the whole structure was trying to hold something precious in its ribs. Sergeant Cade Morrow stepped off the transport shuttle and into air that tasted like copper and old flowers, and he kept his hands in his pockets, because hands were the first thing aliens watched, and his hands had done things that did not belong in diplomatic spaces. The peacekeeping platoon filed out behind him, 12 soldiers in dress uniforms that made them look like waiters at a funeral, and every single one of them was nervous, in the way humans get nervous around things that are bigger and older and more advanced than anything they have ever built. Cade was not nervous. Cade had not been nervous since the surgery, since the 3 months in a windowless room where they took apart his bones and put them back together with something that was not quite metal and not quite alive, since the thing they planted behind his eyes woke up and said hello in a voice that sounded like his dead sister. And he screamed for 6 hours straight before he learned to stop screaming and start listening. His file said rifleman. His file was a work of fiction, more creative than anything the human literary tradition had ever produced. The Veltari were tall, elegant in the way that statues are elegant, with skin that shifted between pale silver and deep violet, depending on their mood. And they moved through their own station like they owned not just the building, but the concept of architecture itself. Commander Draylus met them at the docking ring, with a smile that showed exactly the right number of teeth, which on a Veltari meant she had practiced it in a mirror and still got it slightly wrong. "Welcome to the Spire of Accordance," she said, and her translator made the words sound warm, even though her eyes were running. "Calculations cold enough to freeze starlight." Cade smiled back. His smile was better than hers, because he had been practicing his since before she was born. They were led through corridors that spiraled like the inside of a shell, past walls etched with 10,000 years of Veltari history, rendered in bioluminescent ink that pulsed gently as they walked, and Cade counted 17 hidden weapon emplacements, 4 blast doors disguised as decorative panels, and 1 sniper nest tucked into the ceiling architecture like a spider waiting in a chandelier. The combat AI cataloged all of it in silence, filing each threat under neat little categories that scrolled across the back of his awareness like subtitles in a language only he could read. Then they entered the Hall of Lineages, and Cade stopped counting weapons because something else caught his attention. The hall was enormous, a cathedral within the cathedral, its walls covered floor to ceiling with genealogical records carved into crystal plates that hummed with a faint harmonic resonance. And it was beautiful in the way that obsession is beautiful, in the way that a species saying, "We matter," loud enough to etch it into stone for 100 centuries, is both magnificent and deeply privately sad. He scanned the wall nearest to him. 3rd panel from the left, 4th row down. The crystalline structure had a flaw in it, a micro-pattern inconsistency that did not match the surrounding panels. And the genealogical data encoded in that section had been rewritten sometime in the last 200 years to cover a branch of the family tree that someone wanted erased. A forgery. A very good one. He looked away before anyone noticed him looking, and made a mental note to never mention it, because some lies are load-bearing, and pulling them out brings down the whole house. That was when he saw her. Salith Velthari stood at the far end of the hall, with her arms crossed and her chin tilted at an angle that said she had been watching him since he walked in, and she was not impressed with what she had seen so far. 3rd-born daughter of the ruling house, which in Veltari politics meant she was important enough to be dangerous and unimportant enough to be expendable, a combination that produced either rebels or spies, and she had the eyes of someone who had chosen to be both. Her skin held steady at a deep violet, which meant she was either very calm or very good at lying about her mood, and her hair, if you could call it hair, moved in slow waves like something alive and slightly annoyed. She was assigned to observe the human delegation. Everyone in the room understood this meant she was there to find their weaknesses, catalog their secrets, and report back anything that could be turned into leverage. And everyone in the room pretended not to understand this, because diplomacy is the art of lying politely. While smiling with the wrong number of teeth, Cade walked toward her, because that was his assignment too. Liaison guard, which meant he was supposed to stand near important aliens and look harmless. And he was very good at looking harmless, in the same way that a landmine is very good at looking like dirt. "Sergeant Cade Morrow," he said, and offered his hand. She looked at his hand like it was a foreign object, which, to be fair, it was. "Salith of House Veltari," she said, and did not take it. "That is a lot of name for one person," he said. Her eyes narrowed, and he watched the violet in her skin flicker towards silver for half a second before she caught it and pulled it back. "Your hall of lineages is incredible," he said, and meant it, and did not mention the forgery on the third panel, and the AI behind his eyes whispered that her pulse had increased by 4 beats per minute when he said it, which meant either she was proud of her heritage or she was lying. Knew about the forgery too. The formal dinner came 6 hours later. The food was beautiful and strange, served on plates that sang faintly when touched, and Cade ate everything put in front of him because the modifications to his digestive system meant he could process most organic compounds without harm, and because refusing alien food at a diplomatic dinner was the fastest way to start a war that did not need starting. He sat 3 seats from Salith, and spent the evening being aggressively boring, answering questions about Earth with the kind of carefully rehearsed blandness that made people stop asking. And the whole time the AI was mapping the room, tracking the cloaked guards that the Veltari thought were invisible, following their movement patterns through 3 walls of solid architecture, with a sensory suite that had no business existing inside a human skull. Salith was watching him. She thought she was being subtle about it. Not. Halfway through the 3rd course, she leaned across the conversation to ask him something about human music, and her fingers brushed his forearm, and the world went very quiet and very loud at the same time. The combat AI registered her touch as a potential threat. His reactive skeletal structure began a microshift toward defensive configuration, the metamaterials in his bones hardening, his adrenal system flooding with compounds that had names only in classified documents. And for exactly 0.3 of a second, Sergeant Cade Morrow was closer to killing everyone in that room than anyone at the table would ever know. He shut it down, manually. Overrode his own skeleton with a thought that was half command and half prayer. Forced the metamaterials to stand down. Told the AI in the firmest internal voice he had that the princess was not a threat, and her hand was just a hand, and they were not doing this. Not here, not now, not ever. Thing took less than a heartbeat. Salith pulled her hand back and smiled at him, and said something about violin strings that he did not hear, because he was busy convincing his own body not to turn a dinner party into a morgue. He smiled back. "I would love to hear Veltari music sometime," he said, and his voice did not shake, and his hands stayed in his lap, and no one at the table knew that the most dangerous thing in the room had just chosen, again, to be a man instead of a weapon. Salith watched him for the rest of the evening with something new in her eyes, something that was not suspicion and not curiosity, but the first faint edge of something far more dangerous to both of them. She did not know what he was. She only knew that when she touched him, something behind his eyes moved, something fast and deep and carefully caged, and he had smiled through it like a man who had been smiling through things his whole life. The cage was for P. She had no idea that the answer would change everything she believed about humans, about weapons, about what it meant to be something terrible and still choose to be kind. The ceasefire was 3 weeks old and already showing cracks like cheap glass. thin lines spreading through the diplomatic architecture that everyone could see and no one would name out loud. Cade noticed the first crack on a Tuesday. A human private named Erickson was found in Cargo Bay 7, with 2 broken ribs and a fractured orbital bone. And the security footage for that section had been conveniently corrupted in a way that required either advanced technical skill or access to the station's administrative systems. And both options pointed in directions that made the diplomatic corps very uncomfortable. Commander Drylus called it an unfortunate incident. The Veltari Security Division called it an ongoing investigation. Cade called it a message. He had seen messages like this before, written in broken bones and convenient camera failures, on colony worlds where the ceasefire was just a word people used while they sharpened their knives. Knew that messages like this always came in sequences, each one louder than the last, until the final message was not written in bone, but in blood. The AI agreed with his assessment and offered 17 tactical responses ranked by lethality. He told it to shut up. Salith found him in the observation gallery that evening, standing in front of the viewport, with his hands in his pockets, watching a gas giant rotate in the distance with the patient attention of someone who had learned to find peace in things that were too large to hurt him. "Your soldier," she said, and stopped, because she was not sure how to finish the sentence in a way that was both honest and diplomatic. "Will live," Cade said. "I was going to say I am sorry." "No, you were not." The violet in her skin flickered, and she crossed her arms, and he watched her decide whether to be offended or impressed, and land somewhere in the middle. "You are very direct for a diplomat," she said. "I am not a diplomat," he said, and this was the most honest thing he had told anyone on this station. She studied him the way she had been studying him for 3 weeks now, with that particular intensity that the Veltari brought to things they could not categorize. And he let her look because the surface was clean. The surface was always clean, and what lived underneath was buried so deep that even most human scanning technology could not find it. What she could not see was the constant war behind his eyes. Every room he entered, the AI painted it red, threat vectors in sharp geometric lines, kill corridors mapped with mathematical elegance, structural weaknesses highlighted and catalogued with the cold appreciation of something that understood buildings only as things that could be collapsed. Every person he met, the AI whispered their vulnerabilities. The Veltari guard captain with the slightly weak left knee. The ambassador whose translator. Implant created a 2-second processing delay he could exploit. The servant whose uniform concealed a ceremonial blade that could be repurposed in 9 different lethal configurations. And underneath all of it, running like a dark river through every calculation, the AI spoke to him in her voice, his sister. Not really, of course. The AI had no gender, no identity, no face. But when they wired it into his neural architecture, it had latched on to his deepest emotional imprint and built its communication interface around the voice of the person he missed most. Because the engineers had discovered that soldiers responded faster to voices they loved. And no one on the ethics board had raised their hand to say that maybe this was a monstrous thing to do to a person. He had not told anyone. He would not tell anyone. Some wounds were structural, and removing them meant the whole building came down. "Walk with me," Salith said, and it was not a request. They walked through the spire's inner corridors, past galleries filled with Veltari art that moved when observed and stilled when ignored, through gardens where bioluminescent plants responded to emotional states and bloomed brighter as Salith passed. And Cade noticed that the plants dimmed slightly around him, as if they could sense something cold moving through their light. Salith noticed too. She did not mention it. "The ossuary pact is growing louder," she said, and the way she said it told him she was giving him something valuable, something she should not be sharing with a human soldier whose file said rifleman, and whose eyes said otherwise. The Ossuary Pact, a faction within the hegemony that wanted the alliance with humanity dissolved, that saw humans as primitives, useful only as cannon fodder or curiosities, that believed the ceasefire was a betrayal of Velthari's supremacy. Cade had read their literature. It reminded him of things he had read in human history, the same arguments wearing different skin, the same fear dressed up as pride, and he had learned long ago that species did not matter when it came to the specific stupidity of believing that strength meant you should never extend your hand. "They broke your soldier," Salith said. "Yes. They will do worse. Yes." "You do not seem concerned." He turned to look at her, and for half a second, maybe less, he let something shift behind his eyes. Not the full thing, not the weapon, just the shadow of it. The suggestion that what she was looking at was not the whole picture, and her breath caught in a way that was almost invisible and entirely telling. "I am the least concerned person on this station," he said, and smiled, and the smile was warm and real and built on top of something that was neither. 3 days later, the translator sabotage began. Small things at first, a word swapped here, a phrase inverted there, just enough to create friction without creating evidence. And the diplomatic conversations grew thorny, with misunderstandings that were not misunderstandings at all, but tiny knives slipped between the ribs of every exchange. Then the supply shipments started arriving at the wrong docks, rerouted through systems that added 6 hours to every delivery. And the human platoon began running low on specific nutritional supplements that their biology required, and Velthari biology did not. And this was the kind of warfare that left no bruises and no evidence and no one to blame. Cade adapted. He always adapted. That was what the metamaterials were for, what the AI was for, what the whole terrible architecture of Project Kindling was for. But this kind of adaptation was quieter. Just a man learning to eat less, sleep lighter, watch sharper, and keep his hands in his pockets while the world tried to provoke him into taking them out. She did this casually, as if it meant nothing, leaving containers of Veltari nutrition supplements that her research had confirmed were compatible with human biology. And she placed them in his quarters without discussion, and he ate them without acknowledgement, and they both pretended this was not happening, because naming it would make it political, and politics would kill it. She was mapping him. She knew this about herself, knew she had been sent to observe and catalog and report. But the map she was building was not the one her superiors wanted. She was mapping the pauses, the 2-beat delay before he answered any question about his past. Not the hesitation of someone who was lying, but the careful navigation of someone who was telling the truth selectively, choosing which truths were safe to release into the world, and which ones would cause damage if they escaped. She was mapping his hands, the way they stayed in his pockets, or flat on surfaces, never gesturing, never loose, always controlled with a precision that spoke of someone who had been taught that his hands were not entirely his own. She was mapping the moments when he read Veltari's script. She had caught him 3 times now, sitting in the archive with original texts open in front of him, reading poetry in a language he should not know, and the look on his face in those moments was the only time she had seen him without his armor on. Not his uniform. His armor. The invisible thing he wore between himself and everything else. One evening, she sat beside him in the archive and asked which poet he preferred, and he said the name so correctly that her skin flushed silver before she could stop it. "You speak Veltari," she said. "I read it," he said, which was a different thing and also a lie, and they both knew it. That night, a Veltari noble named Kathos confronted a human officer in the central atrium, loudly and publicly, with the kind of theatrical outrage that was designed not to resolve a problem, but to create an audience. Cade was across the atrium in 11 seconds. He did not run, did not push, did not raise his voice. He simply appeared between Kathos and the officer, like something that had always been there, and everyone had failed to notice, and he stood still, hands at his sides for once, and said nothing. Kathos was tall even for a Velthari, silver-skinned and sharp-featured, and accustomed to being the most intimidating presence in any room. He looked into Cade's eyes. He left the room. Salith watched this from the gallery above, and felt something rearrange itself inside her chest. Not the surface emotion she was accustomed to managing, but something deeper, something tectonic. Because she had seen Velthari warriors face down warships without flinching, and she had just watched one of her own nobles walk away from a human who had done nothing but stand still and look at him. "What did he see?" she asked Cade later. "Probably his reflection," Cade said. He was not joking. She thought he was. That night she accessed restricted human biological data through channels she should not have had access to, and found Cade's file. It was almost empty. The parts that were not empty were lies, generic service records, standard medical clearances, a psychological evaluation so blandly normal it could only have been written by someone who had never met him. And the parts that were empty, the redacted sections, the classified blocks, the gaps where information should have been and was not. They were shaped exactly like a weapon. She closed the file and sat in the dark and listened to her own breathing, and tried to understand why the empty spaces in his record frightened her less than they should have, why the shape of what he might be made her lean closer instead of pulling away. Explain it? She did not try. She just sat with it, the way he sat with everything, quietly, carefully, with her hands still and her breathing steady, and the knowledge that some things could not be understood in a single night, settling into her bones like a familiar ache. The explosion came at the worst possible time, which was of course the entire point. Cade was in the middle of a sentence, something meaningless about supply logistics, the kind of conversation designed to be so boring that anyone listening would stop. When the floor kicked upward and the ceiling came down, and the world turned into noise and heat and flying architecture. He moved before the sound finished. The combat AI took over his sensory processing in the first half-second, painting the chaos in clean geometric overlays, identifying the blast origin as 30 meters starboard, classifying the explosion type as a shaped plasma charge designed to collapse structural supports without breaching the hull, and flagging this as professional military work, not amateur sabotage. The ossuary pact had stopped sending messages. They were sending sentences. Cade grabbed the human officer beside him and threw her toward the emergency corridor, with enough force to look desperate and not enough to look inhuman. And then he was running toward the blast zone, because the AI was telling him there were life signs in the collapse section, and some of them were fading. The station screamed around him. Alarms, emergency lighting, turning the corridors into stuttering red nightmares. Automated systems sealing bulkheads with the mechanical indifference of a building that cared more about its own survival than the people inside it. He found Salith on the other side of a collapsed beam. She was not alone. 2 Velthari civilians, a child no older than 6, and an elderly worker whose leg was bent in a direction that legs were not designed to go, were with her, in a pocket of space that was shrinking as the structural supports above them groaned and shifted. And Salith was holding the child against her chest with one arm, and bracing against the wall with the other, and her skin was cycling through colors so fast it looked like panic made visible. "Cade," she said, and his name in her voice hit him somewhere the AI could not map. The beam between them weighed approximately 400 kilograms. A human could not move it. Cade looked at the beam and looked at Salith and looked at the child, whose eyes were wide and wet and silver, and he made a decision that every protocol in his body told him not to make. He put his hands on the beam. The metamaterials in his bones responded before his conscious mind finished giving the order. Shifting from passive to active configuration. redistributing density and leverage through his skeletal structure in ways that turned his arms into something that was technically still human, and practically something else entirely. And he pulled. The beam moved. Not easily. Nothing about this was easy. Not the physical act, and not the exposure it represented. But it moved, grinding against the floor with a sound like teeth. High enough to create a gap, and held it there while his muscles did things that muscles should not do, and his skin rippled in ways that skin absolutely should not. "Go," he said, and his voice was steady, because the AI was managing his vocal output, even as his body operated at a capacity that would have killed an unmodified human. Sylith pushed the child through the gap first, then helped the elderly worker, and then she came through herself, and she was close enough to see his arms, to really see them, and what she saw made her stop moving for one terrible second. The skin on his forearms was not behaving like skin. It was shifting, microstructures visible just beneath the surface, moving in patterns that were too regular to be organic, and too fluid to be mechanical, and where his hands gripped the beam, the metal was deforming slightly, not from pressure, but from something chemical, something in his sweat that was dissolving the alloy at the molecular. He dropped the beam, and it hit the floor, and the sound was enormous and final. The elderly worker was moaning, and Cade knelt beside him and put his hands on the broken leg, and his fingers moved with a precision that did not belong to a sergeant or a rifleman or any human whose file said what his file said. They moved like surgical instruments, finding the fracture by touch, applying pressure at points that a field medic should not know, and with a steadiness that was mechanical in its perfection. He set the bone. The worker gasped, and then went quiet, and Cade's hands pulled away, and they were just hands again, just skin and knuckle and fingernail. And if you had not seen what they were doing 3 seconds ago, you would never know they were anything else. The child was staring at him. Children saw things that adults trained themselves not to see, and this child had seen something, and Cade looked at the child, and the child looked back. Of them said anything, because some conversations do not require words. "We need to move," Cade said. He picked up the child, because the child's legs were shaking too hard to walk, and the child weighed almost nothing in arms that had just moved 400 kilograms of structural beam. And he carried the child against his chest, and the child's small hands gripped his uniform, and the AI registered the contact, and classified it, and moved on. Sylith walked behind him. She was quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet. Not the calculated silence of an observer gathering data, but the absolute stillness of someone whose entire framework for understanding the world had just been dismantled and rebuilt in a different shape. She watched his shoulder. The piece of shrapnel she had seen hit him, a fragment of wall panel spinning through the debris cloud, burying itself in the meat of his left shoulder with a sound she would not forget. Gone. Not removed. Gone. The wound had closed in the time it took her to blink 6 times, and she knew this because she had counted, because her mind did that under stress, counted things, measured things, cataloged things, and what she was cataloging now was the fact that the human carrying a Velthari child through a burning corridor had just healed from a wound that should have taken weeks in a span of seconds. They reached the emergency shelter, and Cade set the child down gently, and the child did not want to let go. And for a moment his face did something that the AI could not control, and did not try to, something soft and broken and human in a way that had nothing to do with biology, and everything to do with the kind of man who carries other people's children through fire. Medical teams arrived. The worker was taken to surgery, and the child was reunited with a parent who held them so tight that Cade looked away, and Sylith watched him look away, and understood something about him that all his files and all her observations had not told her. The weapon had a heart, and the heart was the most dangerous part. She waited until the corridor was clear, and the medical teams had moved on, and the alarms had faded to a low, persistent hum. and then she stood in front of him and looked at him the way she looked at forged genealogical records, with the precise attention of someone who knew they were seeing a lie and wanted to understand the truth underneath it. "How long have you been like this?" she said. He did not pretend to misunderstand. "To find this," he said. "Not human," she said. The silence that followed was the longest silence of his life. Longer than the silence after the surgery. Longer than the silence after his sister's death. Longer than the silence in the windowless room when the thing behind his eyes said, "Hello," and he realized he would never be alone again. "In this room," he said. He paused. "That is the problem." She did not step back. She did not cycle through fear colors, or defensive postures, or any of the 100 things a Velthari was supposed to do when confronted with something dangerous and unknown. She reached out and took his hand. His hand, the hand that had bent steel and dissolved metal and set bones with mechanical precision, sat in hers and did nothing except be warm, and still, and present. The combat AI assessed the contact. For the first time in its operational history, across 12 deployments, 47 engagements, and more kills than Cade allowed himself to count, the AI did not classify a living being's touch as a threat. It simply observed, and Cade stood in a burned corridor, holding the hand of an alien princess, and felt something he had not felt since before the surgery, since before the war, since before they took his bones apart and put them back together, with something that was not quite metal and not quite alive. He felt safe. He did not trust it, but he held her hand and let it exist anyway, the way she had let the empty spaces in his file exist without running. And they stood together in the wreckage, while the station healed around them, and the bioluminescent plants in the nearest garden bloomed bright and steady for the first time since he had come aboard. Where his blood had dripped onto the floor, the metal was slightly dissolved. Syleth looked at it. She said nothing. Some truths did not need to be spoken to be understood, and some silences carried more weight than any word in either of their languages, and they stood in that silence together, and let it hold what neither of them was ready to say. The orders came through encrypted channels at 3 a.m. station time, routed through 6 relay points, and scrubbed of origin data so thoroughly that even Cade's AI had to work for 9 seconds to trace them back to Earth Command. 9 seconds was an eternity in AI time. The message was simple. Asset compromised. Initiate extraction protocol switchback. Transport window 0600, station local. Acknowledge. Cade read it in the dark of his quarters, where the lights were off, because he did not need them, and because the dark was the only place the AI let him think without commentary. And he read it again, and a third time. And then he sat on the edge of his bunk, and put his face in his hands, and did something he had not done in 4 years. He told the AI to be quiet. It complied. The silence in his head was terrifying. A vast empty room, where his sister's stolen voice usually lived, where tactical overlays and threat assessments usually painted the world in clean geometric certainty. And in that silence, he found something he had been avoiding. He did not want to leave. This was a problem. Project Kindling Assets did not want things. This was by design, part of the psychological architecture they built alongside the physical modifications, a carefully engineered emotional flatness that kept the weapon pointed outward and never inward. But the engineering was not perfect. It had never been perfect. The scientists who built him understood bones and nerves and metamaterials and combat algorithms, but they did not understand the specific stubbornness of a human being who had volunteered to become a weapon because his sister died on a colony world that burned, while the fleet was too slow and too weak and too human to save her. They did not understand that the same stubbornness that walked into a surgical suite and said, "Make me into something that can prevent this," stubbornness that could look at an alien woman and say, "I am staying," The AI came back online, without being asked. It was worried. Cade could tell it was worried because his serotonin levels dropped 11% in 6 seconds, which was not a natural fluctuation, but a targeted neurochemical adjustment, designed to make the world feel slightly colder, slightly more threatening, slightly more like a place he should leave. He recognized the manipulation because he had been living with it for years, the gentle invisible hand on the scale of his emotions, tipping him toward compliance and away from connection. And he had learned to feel it, the way a sailor learns to feel a current, not by seeing it, but by noticing when he drifted. He pushed back, not with code or command protocols, but with the blunt biological force of a man who was still a man underneath everything they had done to him. And he thought about Salith's hand in his, and the way the body, bioluminescent plants had bloomed, and the child who had not wanted to let go, and his serotonin climbed back up 3% through sheer biochemical defiance. The AI noted this and began running contingency protocols. Cade ignored them. Morning came, and he did not go to the transport window, and at 0607, his encrypted channel lit up with a single word, "Explain," and he turned it off. Salith found him in the archive again, reading poetry, and this time she did not sit beside him in comfortable silence. She sat across from him with a data tablet in her hands, and the expression of someone who had spent the entire night pulling threads and did not like the tapestry they revealed. "I know about kindling," she said. He closed the book. "You know a name," he said. "I know a shape," she said, and the way she said it told him she was not guessing, she was not speculating, she had found something real, something with edges, and she was holding it carefully, because she understood that real things with edges could cut. "Tell me the shape," he said. She told him. Fragments, intercepted intelligence briefings, medical anomalies flagged by Veltari bioscanners that the human delegation did not know existed. A pattern of redacted service records across 37 human soldiers stationed at diplomatic posts throughout the galactic arm, each one with the same suspicious emptiness in their files, each one assigned to positions that were technically unimportant and strategically critical. 37 weapons, she said, and her voice was steady, but her skin was not, silver and violet, warring across her collarbone in a display she could not control, hidden in plain sight across every major alliance contact point. "We prefer the term assets," Cade said, and the joke landed flat, because it was not entirely a joke. "Why?" she said, and the question was not about kindling, it was about him, about why a man would volunteer to have his bones replaced and his mind shared, and his sister's voice stolen for a machine's use. He told her, not everything. There was not enough time in any language for everything, but the shape of it, the war that came before the ceasefire, the Kethrani scourge that swept through the outer colonies like fire through paper, the worlds that burned while humanity's fleet arrived too late with too little, the specific and personal horror of watching a transmission from a colony called New Meridian as its atmosphere ignited, and knowing that his sister was somewhere in that light. He told her about the year that followed, the year humanity looked at itself in the mirror and did not like what it saw, a species too soft, too slow, too fragile to protect the things it loved, and the decision that came after, not spoken in grand halls or recorded in heroic speeches, but made in small rooms by people who understood that surviving sometimes meant becoming something you would not want to meet in the dark. "We could not win by being brave," he said, and his voice was the voice of someone describing a scar they gave themselves, not proud, not ashamed, just honest about the price of still being alive. "So you became weapons," she said. "So we became weapons," he said. She was quiet for a long time. The archive hummed around them, 10,000 years of Velthari knowledge stored in crystal and light. And somewhere in that vast repository there were records of every war the hegemony had ever fought, and every compromise it had ever made. And every time a civilization had looked at the abyss and decided to become something it never intended to be in order to survive. The Ossuary Pact has a second operation, she said. The tonal shift was absolute, and she did not signal it, because she had learned something about him and was now applying it. The cut, the direct transition, the trust that he would follow without a bridge. He followed. She laid out the intelligence on the table between them. Data streams, communication intercepts, troop movements that did not match any announced exercise. And what they revealed was not another attack on the humans, but something larger and worse. A decapitation strike. The Ossuary Pact intended to eliminate the hegemony's ruling council in a single coordinated assault, using the chaos to seize emergency authority and blame the attack on human operatives, simultaneously destroying the alliance and installing themselves as the new power structure. It was elegant. It was brutal. And when Cade looked at the intelligence laid out before him, he did something that frightened Salith more than the metamaterials beneath his skin, more than the dissolved metal where his blood had fallen, more than the wound that healed in 6 blinks. He smiled. Not cruelty. She had learned to read him well enough to know that, but recognition, the expression of a tool looking at the exact problem it was designed to solve, the quiet satisfaction of purpose aligning with capability for the first time since he had been assigned to a babysitting gig and told to keep his hands in his pockets. "You have seen this before," she said. "I was built for this," he said. She watched him reach for his encrypted communication device, the one he had turned off that morning, and watched him activate it, and watched him compose a message that was not a request for extraction, but something else entirely. A request for activation. The response came in 40 seconds. Confirm engagement parameters. Salith was standing close enough to hear his reply, and close enough to see the change that moved through him when he said it. Not a physical change, not the metamaterials shifting, or the AI taking control, but something subtler, something in the architecture of who he was, clicking into place like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting. Unlimited, he said. The word hung in the air between them. Unlimited, no restrictions on force, no containment protocols, no requirement to preserve his cover or protect his identity or pretend to be anything other than what he was. Salith looked at him and saw for the first time the full shape of what she had been circling for weeks. Not a soldier pretending to be harmless, not a weapon pretending to be a man, but something more complicated and more frightening than either. A man who had chosen to become a weapon and was now choosing to use himself, fully and without reservation, to protect people who were not his species, and a woman who was not his kind, and a peace that the universe had not yet decided to allow. "What happens now?" she said. "Now I stop pretending," he said. The AI hummed in his skull, alive and eager and terrible, and for the first time since they had been joined. It was not pulling him away from something, but pointing him toward it. And the voice that sounded like his sister said 3 words that were not in any protocol manual. Bring them home. He did not know if the AI meant the humans, or the Velthari, or Salith specifically. He decided it meant all of them. The coup began at dawn, station time, because even those who plotted against the light preferred to start their revolutions when the artificial sun rose through the spire's crystal lattice and painted everything in gold, as if the universe might mistake their treachery for something beautiful. Cade felt it before the first shot was fired. The AI registered the micro-vibrations of shock troops moving in formation through the station's service corridors. 243 individual footfalls, mapped and identified by gate signature. Equipment loadout estimated by the specific acoustic profile of each step. And the whole terrible orchestra of approaching violence laid out in his awareness like sheet music for a symphony he had been trained to conduct. He was already moving. The reactive metamaterials had shifted to full combat configuration 6 minutes before the first explosion, which meant his bones were no longer bones in any medical sense, but adaptive structural elements that could redistribute mass and density in real time. Hardening, where impact was expected. Flexing, where mobility was required. Turning his skeleton into something that was less a framework for a body and more a chassis for a weapons platform that happened to be shaped like a man. His skin changed. Not visibly. Kindling engineers had been very careful about that, about maintaining the surface illusion of humanity, even when everything underneath had abandoned the concept. But at the cellular level, his epidermis was now a reactive barrier, hardening on impact to absorb kinetic energy, softening between strikes to maintain flexibility, and running a constant chemical analysis of the air for toxins, biological agents, and explosive residue. His eyes did something that no human eye had ever been designed to do. They widened. Not the pupils. The pupils had stopped being relevant to his visual processing 2 years ago. But the perception behind them. The bandwidth of sensory input flooding through neural pathways that had been rebuilt to handle information at a rate that would have caused a normal human brain to hemorrhage. The world slowed down. Not literally. Time was time, even for weapons. But his processing speed accelerated until the gap between perception and action collapsed to something so small it was functionally instantaneous. And in that expanded moment, he could see everything, track everything, calculate everything. He could see the shock troops breach the eastern corridor in a standard 4-point formation that the AI identified as Veltari Military Doctrine Variant 6. Designed for corridor clearing with minimal collateral damage, which told him that the Ossuary Pact wanted the station intact and the Council dead and everything else negotiable. He could see Salith on the communication array 3 levels above, her fingers moving across holographic interfaces with a point, speed, and precision that matched his own in a different register, shutting down the Pact's communication blackout node by node. Broadcasting emergency alerts to the outer systems, fighting the war he could not fight, the one made of words and authority and the specific power of a princess who had decided that her inheritance was not a throne, but a responsibility. He could see everything. And then he stopped seeing and started doing. The first squad of shock troops came around the corner and found him standing in the middle of the corridor with his hands at his sides. And for 1/2 second they hesitated, because he looked like what his file said. A rifleman, a sergeant, a man. And that 1/2 second was all the time in the world. He moved. The AI and the man moved together in a synchronization that had taken years of shared consciousness to achieve. The machine providing targeting solutions and tactical analysis and optimal force calculations, while the man provided something the machine did not have and could not replicate. Judgment, mercy, the specific human capacity to decide, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, that this one lives and this one falls and this one gets a chance to surrender. The first trooper went down to a strike that collapsed his weapon and his fighting stance simultaneously, leaving him disarmed and conscious on the floor, with instructions from Cade's voice that were clear and calm and carried the absolute authority of someone who could have killed him and chose not to. The second trooper fired. The energy bolt hit Cade in the chest and his skin absorbed it, the reactive barrier converting kinetic energy to heat that dispersed through his metamaterial infrastructure in a wave that would have looked, on a thermal scanner, like a man briefly catching fire from the inside. He did not stop moving. The second trooper went down, then the third, then the fourth, and Cade moved through the corridor like something the Velthari had no mythology for. Not a berserker, not a machine, not a demon or a god, but something worse, because it was none of those things. It was just a man who had been rebuilt to survive the unsurvivable, and who used that capability with the precise and terrible restraint of someone who understood that the power to kill everything in a room meant nothing if you could not choose not to. He reached the central stairwell, and the AI painted 27 hostiles across 4 floors, and offered an optimal engagement sequence that would neutralize all of them in 14 seconds with an acceptable casualty rate. And Cade rejected it because acceptable was not the same as 0, and he was not interested in acceptable today. He took the stairs. Each floor was a new calculation, a new set of decisions made in fractions of seconds that each carried the weight of a life, and he made them with the fluidity of someone who had practiced this in simulation and in reality, and in the dark space behind his eyes, where the AI ran scenarios while he pretended to sleep. A group of Velthari servants were huddled in a maintenance alcove on the 3rd floor, pressed together in a cluster of silver-violet fear, and a squad of pack troopers was approaching from the north corridor, and the geometry of the situation meant that Cade could either engage the squad or shield the servants, but not both in the time available. He shielded the servants. He put his body between them and the corridor, and took the fire that came through the opening, 6 energy bolts hitting him in sequence across his back and shoulders, and his body absorbed them the way a mountain absorbs rain, completely, indifferently, as a simple function of being what it was. The servants watched a human take weapons fire that would have killed any of them, and remained standing with his arms spread and his back to the enemy and his face turned toward them, with an expression that was not pain and not anger, but something they would later describe to their families as the saddest gentleness they had ever seen. He turned around and dealt with the squad in 4 seconds. No kills. He did not need to kill. Kindling had given him the capacity to destroy, and humanity had given him the choice not to. And he exercised that choice like a muscle, over and over, throughout every engagement. Because the point was not to prove that humans were the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. The point was to prove that the most dangerous thing in the galaxy could still be kind. Saylet's voice came through the station's emergency frequency, broadcasting to every receiver on every deck, and her voice was command and fury, and the specific authority of a woman who had stopped observing and started leading. She was dismantling the coup from the inside, exposing the ossuary pack's conspiracy with evidence transmitted to every allied system simultaneously, stripping away the political cover that the pact had built over years of careful manipulation, and her words hit harder than any weapon Cade carried because they were true, and the truth, when spoken by someone willing to burn their own safety to deliver it, was the most destructive force in any civilization. Cade reached the council chamber. The door was sealed, not just locked, but welded, fused at the molecular level by someone who understood that what was happening inside should not be interrupted. He put his hand on the door. The metamaterials in his palm interfaced with the alloy, the same chemical reaction that dissolved floor plates where his blood fell, now applied with intention and control, and the seals softened and gave way, and the door opened. Inside, the pack's leader, a Velthari commander named Osith, whose name had become the faction's title, whose ambition had become a movement, whose fear of human contamination had become a weapon pointed at his own people, held an energy blade to the High Matriarch's throat. Standard hostage calculus. The math was simple. 1 life against 1 demand, 1 blade against 1 retreat. The ancient ugly arithmetic of someone who had run out of strategies and was left with nothing but the willingness to destroy what they could not control. Cade stood at the door. On the comm screen, behind Osif, Saylet appeared. Her image broadcast across the station, her eyes finding the camera, finding Cade through the camera. And for one moment, the war stopped being about politics and power and species, and became about 2 people looking at each other across a burning room. No words, none were needed. Cade moved. One frame he was at the door. Next frame the energy blade was in his hand, and Osith was on the floor, pinned face down, with his arms locked behind him, in a hold that was absolutely not lethal, and was absolutely not gentle. and the High Matriarch was untouched and gasping, and staring at the human who had crossed 12 meters of open space in a span that her eyes could not track and her mind could not process. The AI had recommended termination. The AI had presented a clean solution, efficient, permanent, the kind of ending that weapons were designed to deliver. Cade chose different. He chose to pin instead of kill, to restrain instead of destroy, to leave Osith alive and conscious and aware that his life was a gift from the thing he feared most. And this choice, this small deliberate mercy in the middle of catastrophic violence, was the most human thing that happened in the entire war. The aftermath was long and political and full of the kind of careful language that civilizations use to describe the moments where they almost destroyed themselves and decided not to. The alliance held. Stronger now, not despite the blood, but because of it. Because shared crisis has a bonding property that no treaty can replicate. And the Veltari and the humans looked at each other across the wreckage, and saw not aliens, but people who had fought for each other when it mattered. Earth Command sent a new extraction order. Salith stood before the full Hegemony Council, her skin a steady deep violet that betrayed nothing, and made a case that no Veltari had ever made in 10,000 years of recorded history. "You have spent 10 millennia building walls against the dark," she said, and her voice carried through the chamber with the resonance of someone who had stopped being a third-born inconvenience and become something the hegemony did not have a title for. The humans walked into the dark and became it, and then walked back out carrying their kindness in their teeth. That is not a species you want on the other side of a border. The council deliberated for 3 hours. They approved her request, reassigned as a permanent diplomatic attachment, a title that had never existed before, and that everyone understood was a polite fiction wrapped around something that had no precedent and no protocol and no name in either language. He found Salith in the observation gallery that evening, standing in front of the viewport where he had stood weeks ago, watching the same gas giant rotate in the same patient silence, and she turned when she heard him, and her skin did something it had never done before. It settled, not to one color, but to a warmth between silver and violet that was new, that was hers, that was the color of someone who had stopped performing a mood and started simply having one. "The AI," she said, and stopped, and started again. "What does it think of me now?" He stood beside her. "It classified you 3 days ago," he said. "As what?" He looked at her, and the thing behind his eyes, the combat AI built on his sister's voice, the machine, that had whispered threat assessments and kill solutions and exit strategies for 4 years without pause, was quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. Not the silence of shutdown, but the silence of something that had found a place where silence was enough. "Home," he said. The AI did not object. The gas giant turned in the dark outside the viewport, massive and patient and indifferent to the small warm thing happening in its light. And Cade stood beside Salith in the observation gallery of a station that was not his, among a species that was not his, in a life that no protocol had ever planned for. And for the first time since the surgery, since the war, since the windowless room where they unmade him and remade him and gave him a dead girl's voice for company, for the first time the weapon rested, not deactivated, not powered down, just resting. The way a man rests when he has finally found the thing worth putting his hands down. And Salith took his hand, and the bioluminescent plants in the nearest garden bloomed so bright that the whole corridor filled with light, and the two of them stood there in it, the princess and the weapon, the spy and the soldier, two people who had no business fitting together and fit anyway, and the light held them the way good stories hold their endings, not with resolution, but with the promise that whatever came next, they would face it together, standing in the glow of something neither of them had expected and both of them had chosen, and the universe, vast and dark and full of teeth, would simply have to make room.